Okay, hello and welcome to Patent's book study series, Structured Literacy Intervention, Teaching Students with Reading Difficulties grades K to 6. My name is Dr. Pam Kastner, and I have the honor of serving as Patent State Lead for Literacy. Joining me this evening from the Patent Literacy team is our Regional Literacy Lead from Patent West, Jeannie Hertzler, give you a little wave there, and from our central office, Karen Deary. Tonight, our focus will be Chapter 4, Structured Literacy Interventions for Spelling. And we are so honored to have Dr. Louisa Moats leading our learning in this area. We have placed a link in the chat to this book study on the Patent Literacy Resource Hub. Here you will find the book study schedule, information about the book, and a Padlet where recordings and resources for this book study will be found. Please place questions for Dr. Moats in the chat. At the conclusion of tonight's presentation, we will have a brief time to pose these questions to the presenters. Just as an FYI, the questions come to me directly as the host. You may also direct them privately to Jeannie Hertzler and Karen Deary. And now I have the honor of turning it over to my colleague, Karen Deary, to share the amazing Dr. Moats' bio.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us. It is my pleasure to introduce our chapter presenter for this evening, Dr. Louisa Moats. Dr. Moats is the lead author of Letters Professional Development and the author of many scientific journal articles, policy papers, and books about reading, spelling, and language. Dr. Moats, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I am absolutely delighted to have a chance to spend the next hour with all of you talking about my favorite subject. It's been just the study of spelling and trying to understand spelling from a number of different angles has been one of my favorite pursuits ever since I was in graduate school. I did my dissertation on spelling, my first papers on spelling, and I'm still trying to figure out what's what. So here we go. This chapter starts out with the observation that we sometimes forget that learning to spell is difficult. There are a lot more kids with spelling problems even than there are with reading problems, and kids with reading problems, of course, have spelling problems. That's a given. So why is learning to spell difficult? Well, it requires us to form a complete, accurate internal representation of a word. And that is another way of saying that is the memory for a word that we have in our word form areas of the brain has to be fully specified. It has to be correct in every detail, or otherwise we make spelling errors, right? And it's something to think about why we have so many students who read better than they spell. And one obvious implication of that is that being able to read a word does not guarantee that we can spell it. So there's something qualitatively different and more demanding about spelling that is not true of reading. And also, unfortunately for us in the teaching profession, remediation often has limited effects. That is, we all have had the experience, if we've been around for a while, of working with students for months on just straightening out a couple of homophones or something like that, or some high frequency irregular words, or some words that they desperately need to know for the subject matter writing that they're having to do, and the words just don't stick, even if we have practiced them a lot. So it's a bit of a puzzle for us in instruction to figure out how we can help kids who plateau at a fairly low level of spelling accuracy. So I like to begin the discussion of spelling and spelling as a challenge for teaching by going over with you a framework that I think many of you are familiar with, and that, of course, is Erie's phases. And Erie's phases characterize what kids go through as they learn how to read and spell. One of the reasons I love Linnea Erie's work is that it does describe spelling in relation to reading, and her phase theory takes spelling into account as well as reading. but also other researchers who've explored these phenomena are Rebecca Treeman, who comes at the issue of spelling development a little bit differently and sometimes challenges Lene Eerie's framework. And then further back, especially in the 1990s, the University of Virginia group that included Shane Templeton and Donald Baer. And then earlier than that, in the 1980s, Glenda Bissix did a qualitative analysis of her own son's spelling development. It's a qualitative case study that, if you can access it, is very well written and very interesting. It's not controlled research with comparison groups, but the documentation of how her 5-year-old son progressed in his spelling over the first year or two of his academic learning is fascinating and right on the money. So we use the term pre-alphabetic for kids who know something about letters and write strings of letters and then attribute. Somebody is not muted. Okay. And we infer when we see writing like this that the student, if we can't read it back, the student doesn't yet understand the alphabetic principle and doesn't understand what letters are for, but they do know something, and this is Rebecca Treeman's point often, they do know something about how print looks. So if they're making up something, actually, I remember now, this was my daughter's first attempt to write her name, and her name is Charlotte. And she had remembered that there was TTE in there, but it was a rote visual memory thing. And she added a few of her favorite letters in to make it look longer and more like that sort of length and sequence of letters in her name, but obviously wasn't accurate. You can't read it back. And then in the partial alphabetic stage, for which the underpinning is the beginning of phonemic awareness and knowledge of letter names, kids often use letter names to represent speech sounds, and they borrow from letter names to represent speech sounds. So at this stage, this phase, you will see kids using the letter Y for the consonant W, for example, the glide W. And it's because of the letter name and letter sound overlap. We also, at this point, have kids inventing spellings that are partially phonetic. That is, we can kind of figure out what they're trying to write quite often because the salient consonants are there. They often don't separate words with spaces. And the reason why their spellings are incomplete and often just have some salient sounds that can be represented with letter names is that their phonemic awareness is still only partially developed. And until a student has at least basic phonemic awareness, being able to identify each of the phonemes in a 3 or 4 or 5 phoneme sequence, they are going to be telescoping words, as it were, and leaving some sounds out or filling in with random letters to make the word look more like a real word. In the later alphabetic phase, and I love this phase when kids are in this phase, if things are progressing well, we usually see this by the end of kindergarten, as long as the instructional program has given kids the tools to represent phonemes with logical graphemes. We see things like this. We went on a nature trail, or I like to eat pizza and I like to drink pop. So what these spellings show us is that the children have pretty good phoneme awareness, is good enough to represent almost all of the speech sounds in one way or another. What they don't know yet in most instances is how the orthography actually works. But if we look at something like, I like to eat pizza, the fact that long vowels are not actually spelled with single letters, and the kids are using the long vowel letters to represent the letter names to represent the vowels. It's very logical for them to do that. I like to eat pizza. And what's interesting about this to me is that in the word and, the N is omitted because if any of you've been through letters, you know that we talk in Unit 2 about allophonic variation and how it affects kids' spelling. So in this case, the nasal sound is omitted because, in essence, the nasal sound has become a property of the vowel, which has become nasalized, and it is co-articulated with the D. So it is lost in articulation. And when we see spellings like this, which we often do at this stage, it's just telling us a reality about the spoken word. And it's telling us that that segment in what we think of as a blend is really elusive until we teach kids explicitly to be aware that that nasal segment has to be represented with a nasal letter. And then, of course, the drink, pop, and the affrication of the D before R, which is just as accurately represented with J, because if you say drink, your mouth puckers up before the R in that blend, and what comes out of your mouth is very close to something you would represent with either a G or a J. So this kid is telling us that several things. One is they're very glued to sound when they learn how to spell. They're paying close attention to what their mouths are doing. And this is what got me going on my lifelong campaign to get everyone to realize that when we teach phonology, we have to include reference to articulation as we're establishing in the mind of the learner the identity of the speech sounds that make up our words. And then, consolidation, the final.
There's people in there that get carts and they have it just like.
Okay, so to consolidate spelling memories, to consolidate our memories for what is really in print, we have to learn an awful lot of things about how orthography actually works. Phoneme awareness is the underpinning, but we can't become proficient spellers just because we have developed good phoneme awareness. We have to learn a lot about orthographic patterns within words. We have to learn, for example, that OTE is an uncommon representation for oat. We have to learn that when we write the past tense, that ED can sound like t. And if we have a word like walked, where the ED sounds like t, we don't also need to put a letter T in there for that speech sound. We have to learn that a word like noisy, that word is unlikely to end in two E's, is much more likely to end in the letter Y, even though the representation of the speech sound is good. And the same thing with chunk. We have to learn that, yes, that sound is before k. It's a third nasal sound, but it's a convention that we don't use NG to spell that sound before k. So some people just teach UNK as a phonogram. I like, for spelling purposes, to have kids get the explanation that, yes, that sound is that's an accurate phonetic representation, but we don't use NG in front of the K. And then we need to learn about syllable patterns, syllable juncture, the ending rules, which are very teachable, but they have to be taught little by little for several years before kids internalize them. And it becomes a combination of learning specific words that follow each of these rules, the drop silent E and consonant doubling and the Y rule in particular. We have to learn specific whole words that follow these rules and then combine an explicit explanation of what is going on with our growing knowledge of examples, words that follow these patterns. And that takes quite a while. And then we have to learn how morphemes are represented in our spelling system. And we have to learn not to spell basic morphemes phonetically when they do have a standard spelling, such as the DUC and educate, the root there, the NAT root in nature, the CES root in excess, and the prefix EX, which means you don't need an S in there, things like that. Electricity is very common for kids to spell phonetically when they don't understand that words like electricity are constructed from base words and suffixes. And you have to process that word as a derivation of the word electric, where the C is pronounced K instead of S. So the goals of a structured language approach to teaching spelling are to construct a mental layer cake of knowledge of language and a mental, a set of understandings about how our orthography represents language at all of these different levels. At the base layer is the phonological level and phoneme grapheme correspondences. But on top of that is the layer of orthographic patterns and rules and conventions, just how our print system works to represent speech. And then on top of that is the morphological layer, where meaning overrides sound in words like electricity. And then syntax, or the part of speech that a word or the role that a word plays in a sentence, does often have something to do with the way it is spelled, particularly with derivational suffixes, for example, that show the part of speech of the word to which they are added. And sometimes spellings vary according to their grammatical role. So we have to provide sufficient practice with each of these aspects of language representation in print in order to help kids internalize the images of words. And I have become convinced over time that if our spelling instruction were really to capitalize on what we know about the nature of print itself and the learning process, which is essentially linguistic, not a visual memory, rote visual memory process, that we would have a lot more success teaching good spelling to kids. So the first layer, let me say something about each of these layers of the layer cake. What I would like to see happen in our collective approach to teaching phoneme awareness, especially when it comes to teaching spelling, let me get this, is that we should tailor our phoneme awareness activities to complement and support and facilitate the specific orthographic concept that the kids are trying to learn. So, especially with older kids, we're talking about improving spelling of confusable sounds. So, suppose we have kids who just don't really process the difference between j and ch, which are a voiced, voiceless pair of consonants. Well, instead of doing random practice with any kind of, say, substitution or deletion or sound chaining, we would target those sounds to refine the student's awareness of the features of the sounds that are being targeted. So suppose I want in my lesson to teach the kids the pattern that we use TCH at the ends of syllables when ch follows an accented short vowel. So in words like patch, TCH is going to be the spelling for ch in patch. And I have kids who are sometimes writing a G or a J at the end of a word like that. Well, what am I going to do? I'm going to give them exercises. I'm going to say gin, but now change j to ch. What is the word? And I am not going to do this with print. One of the things that is just putting me on edge, all of you who follow the Spell Talk conversation and so on, is this argument that somehow we can teach phoneme awareness using letters. This is not supported by research. It's not what the National Reading Panel said, and it's contrary to logic. If kids are confusing speech sounds like this in their spelling, just showing them the letters isn't getting to the heart of the issue. The issue is phonological, and the remedy is to help the kids refine their phonological awareness for those specific sounds and speech sound confusions that they're having trouble with. So we'd say etch. Now say it, now change ch to j. What do you get? Edge. Say purge. Now change j to ch. What do you get? And so on. And we do this without print. And then we've kind of warmed up. It's like doing calisthenics before you start doing stretches, before you start lifting weights. You want to be ready. So then targeting these sounds for spelling and the ins and outs of how you spell each at the ends of words, the kids will be more ready for that. So the TCH pattern is one pattern to teach, but what about J? Well, no word in English ends in J. So we also are going to be teaching the pattern DGE and GE for J after a vowel when we get to that. And we have to choose in designing our spelling lesson whether to teach these concepts near to each other or apart. It probably depends on the grade level of the students and how fast they can go and what they're ready for and what continuing confusions they're demonstrating. So explicit teaching of the identity of each of the speech sounds is absolutely essential for good spelling instruction, beginning in kindergarten. And what I mean by this is making the information explicit that there are these vowel sounds, and we're going to learn one by one how each of them is spelled. And then for older kids, say intermediate kids who are invariably confusing the vowel spellings in their words, because that's where they make the most errors, because the vowel spellings are the most difficult to learn, we also need to give them this information. Well, here are the sounds we're going to be learning how to spell. Here's why some of them are confusable. The ones that are close in articulation are more difficult to hear. We're going to practice tuning up our ears to hear the difference between eh and ah. We're going to try to feel the difference as we say those sounds and so on. And ah and and so on. So the point of this is, again, for all of you, that the sounds that are close in articulation are going to be more readily confusable. And then when we design our spelling activities, being aware of that as teachers, we may consciously give practice to kids who have to sort out the vowels that are similar. And where spelling begins is to identify the sound in a word first and then contemplate and learn how it is spelled. So then we want to explicitly teach a language concept. In this case, it would be an orthographic concept that j in the beginnings of words is spelled with a J or a G before E, I, or Y. If we have very young kids, that's enough for them to learn. If it's somewhat older kids, I think they're ready for and perhaps interested in this peculiarity that we that why G has its soft sound before E, I, or Y. We can appeal to language history for that. And also the letter J is an oddity. It was added kind of late to our alphabetic writing system. And there's some interesting facts about it. It was one of the last to be added because the sound didn't exist in either Latin or Old English, our base layers of for our vocabulary over time in English. The letter J is never in a consonant blend. The letter J is never doubled, and the letter J is never used at the ends of English words. So this is all information that can add to the meaningfulness of what we're teaching, which can seem quite arbitrary and just dry, arbitrary stuff. But when kids get into exploring why things are the way they are, they can get quite excited about it because the pieces start to fall into place. You know, like there is a reason for the spelling system being the way it is. It's complex and variable, but we can learn things about it. So this kind of exercise, this is an exercise we're right now working on lessons for 4th, 5th graders. So this is one of the lessons, and we have done this work on sorting out the sound J and how it's spelled, and that J is soft G and G is hard G. And if you're going to turn these word parts into real words by adding a letter to the beginning to make a real word that you can identify, what letter would you use? So the kids figure that out, and then they read the word list, and we give them a lot of help. So they do it maybe with partners, and then we show them immediately what the so-called right answer is and have them read the words as they're really spelled. Another activity that everyone I think is familiar with is mapping phonemes to graphemes and taking the words in a spelling lesson and analyzing them. Which letters are corresponding to which speech sounds? And this would be a very good way of contemplating the DGE spelling pattern, because after the words have been taken apart, then we could direct the kids to look at what immediately precedes each DGE spelling. What do all those words have in common? And how is that different from whatever it is that precedes just a GE on the ends of words that end in J? And then the third layer of our spelling system is morphology. And I think those of us who followed the research literature are well aware of the arguments of the people who've contributed to the Spell Links materials. Also, Virginia Berninger has been saying this a long time, that we don't have to wait until kids are proficient in phoneme grapheme mapping, essentially, to introduce morphemes or the concept of morphemes, the concept that meaningful parts of words in English are often spelled consistently, even though their sounds might vary. And of course, the first example of that is the ed ending, and then the suffix ing, ing, but also the plural ending itself. It can be pronounced s or z or s, and it's very hard to have connected text without starting to deal with those basic morphemic realities in our language. One of the things we're doing with the 4th and 5th graders is having them look at base words and roots. And we've talked already about Latin roots and what they are, that they have to exist in combination with prefixes and suffixes that can't stand alone, whereas base words can stand alone. But can the students figure out which is which? Which of these can stand alone, which have to have something else attached to them? And then we can go on from there. So in the lesson, let's see, let me go back a second. Okay, we included in that little exercise ject, starting with j, and jest, starting with j, and gress, starting with g. We included those deliberately, and then the hard g, g in give, and this word jest with j, and in the lesson that included hard and soft g and j, and when you use which, and so on. So then to carry on the idea that morphology and the layer of morphological representation should not be treated as something totally separate, but it can be connected to the rest of the lesson that started out with, let's, hear the difference between j and ch in a spoken word and do a sound substitution. So here we are with the root ject. What does it mean? And given these prefixes, what words can you make with ject, and what do those words mean? And that can be a topic of conversation. It can be an assignment to look them up. It can be kids arguing with one another. It can be kids saying, I never heard of that before, and being introduced to these words. But we don't have to delay introducing kids to reject this whole ject family before they're ready to do a full-blown study of morphology as such. These things can be layered, these ideas about language can be layered one on another over a unit. And then another fact about the relationship between reading and spelling, it's important to keep in mind, and I think I have a few references in the chapter on this, but there have been some good experiments showing that if we teach kids how to spell using good information about language and the layers of language, that instruction translates into faster word reading and overall gains in reading fluency. And why would that be? Just think about our good models of what goes into learning to read. If you have an internal representation or a memory for a word that is fully specified, as our psychologists say, that is, all the letters of the word are there in our memory for the word in the right order, and mentally we have mapped, we've gone through the process of orthographic mapping, we've mapped those letters to the sounds. Then when we read the words, it's very likely that the pathway to retrieving those words is going to be sort of well-oiled. Is the access to that word in memory is going to be better established, and that will enable us to more quickly recognize the words in print. So knowing that, we embed word list reading with the words that have been dissected and constructed from morphemes, and ask kids to see if they can increase their speed on a timed reading of a short list like this. Okay, where are we? Okay, and then the fourth layer of language that we want to pay attention to within a lesson in which that you could describe using Berninger's term, multilinguistic, a multilinguistic lesson. There's the reality with these ject words that depending on the accent or stress pattern of the word, they can play the role of a noun or a verb. So we have objects that are nouns, and we can object to what someone is saying or doing. We can notice that this item is a reject from the assembly line, and we can reject an idea that someone has proposed. We can do a project, which is a noun, or we can project into the future. So asking kids to pay attention to this and understand that there's a relationship between pronunciation and the grammatical role of the word, these very words that they've been reading and constructing by putting prefixes onto roots, is another aspect of linguistic awareness, which is going to enhance. Now, I'm thinking about the diagram I often use in some of my presentations of what goes into a word that we know well. And we talk about lexical quality and deep lexical quality using Perfetti's terms. When we know a word well, we do trigger associations to its potential use in context, and that includes its grammatical role. So another reason why when we have enriched concepts of words in our memories, we're more likely to read them quickly, to use them appropriately, and let's hope spell them accurately. Just a word about high frequency irregular words tonight. High frequency irregular words are getting a lot of attention in various forums. What to do about them? Because in my own research, I've documented this, that kids with spelling problems often misspell the highest frequency irregular words. It's hard for them to remember. And one of the reasons for that is that many of these words are grammatical glue words or function words. And in our brains, it is harder to establish an enriched kind of concept of a word when it's such an abstraction. It's just there for grammatical glue, or it is, and sometimes these words have odd spellings that don't correspond to the speech sounds very well. So what to do about that? Well, in the chapter, I have a few suggestions to draw on when you're helping kids retain words like any and many. No, the spelling is not M-E-N-Y, or the word does. No, we don't write D-U-Z. And the word of, no, it is not UV. And the word there, oh, heaven help us with those words, right? So here are some approaches. Again, think in terms of making anything you can about the word meaningful, or link it, if there is a way to link the word to something else that is memorable. So sometimes there are groups of words, like all the words having to do with two-ness, TWO, two, twice, 20, twilight, and twin, all begin with TW. One, only, and once, all begin with ON, oneness. The possessive there is related to the word air, in spelling anyway. Then where, here, and there all have to do with place. So some kids can be helped by grouping words like this and getting to think about the meaning in relation to the spelling. Another strategy, and Linda Farrell has done some nice videos for Reading Rockets on the heart word technique of calling attention to the odd part of the word, the part that is truly unexpected, the part that has no other family, if you will. It's just an oddity. And then also highlighting what is predictable about the word spelling, because very few words are totally unpredictable. Then a spelling pronunciation, pronouncing the word the way it looks, is a good strategy. And I learned this from the direct instruction people a long time ago. This word looks like was, but we don't say as, we say was, just like that. Using mnemonics, these are old ones, the rat and separate, and the principal is my pal. Sometimes those work. And then asking the learner to pay very close attention to the letter sequence by visualizing it, building it backwards with letter tiles and forward with letter tiles before saying the word, blending it, and then writing it out correctly. That I would use sparingly. It's a novel thing to do. One can certainly criticize the idea that any word has to be memorized in this way, just as a sequence of letters, but it's another way of getting kids to try to retain the letters. But I would prefer trying 1, 2, 3, and 4 before resorting to 5, just because we know that to remember the word, there has to be something akin to orthographic mapping that is relating the sounds of the word to the print, and that rote visual memory is not the key to remembering most words. So to sum up, spelling's harder than word recognition, especially with regard to specific, complex, and elusive linguistic elements. Learning to spell is just as much a language-based skill as learning to read. It is not a rote visual memory skill. Reading and spelling rely on similar linguistic processes. Phonemic awareness and phonological skill, I missed an I there, is a major determinant of spelling achievement. And therefore, it's extremely important to include phoneme awareness in spelling lessons, but to connect the phoneme awareness exercise to what you're intending to teach as far as a reading or spelling concept or pattern. We have to teach language structure directly and systematically at all levels, and spelling is a great opportunity to do that. And then students who understand that orthography can be mapped in systematic ways to speech, and that every word's spelling has an explanation, pretty much, are more likely to attend to the details in print and form lasting memories for the letters in words. So those are my words of wisdom tonight, such as they are. And I have left time for us to have a little discussion here. And I really hope you will chime in. And here are some questions to stimulate your thinking and your postings on the chat or however we're doing this. Why is spelling instruction given so little time and attention? Why do people not care about doing this in a thoughtful and effective way? You know what? Why is it so hard to get the attention that it's due? And if the materials were better, do you think anyone would spend more time teaching spelling as part of word study or writing? What approaches or materials are effective in improving the skills of poor spellers in your experience? So you may know tricks and approaches that I don't know, and I'd love to hear about them. So would everyone. And how do we avoid punishing students for spelling errors while at the same time incentivizing them to work hard at improving the skill when we know it's difficult. So there we go.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moats. There were some questions that came during your presentation. Would it be all right if I ask them to you now?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, here we go. First question. Got to go to top. Can we ask her the last name of Glenda, who taught her 5-year-old to learn to read and spell again? She said
Glenda Bissex. Yeah, Glenda Bissex, Bissex. And the book was called Genius at Work, but it was spelled in phonetic spelling, GYNS at WRK.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Next question. At what point should teachers utilize spelling inventories, and would the skills in the past assessment be a prerequisite to administering a spelling inventory?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm sure there will be better phonemic awareness tools being developed in the future. And there are others, especially at the very beginning levels. My feeling about the past is it has been a very useful tool. And I really like a lot of what David has to say. I'm very much on his side when he talks about what goes into learning to read. He doesn't have as much to say about learning to spell, and I'm trying to get him more interested in that. You know, there's an example of someone who's really dissected what goes into reading and hasn't really gotten so enthusiastic about spelling. But I would say that in combination, if you want to know really what's going on with your students, these are the magic tools for me. Get a spelling example. Look at the errors. Give a spelling inventory. Look at the errors, and do a phonics and word reading survey, and do a phonemic awareness test. And those are the things, of course, that we have included in letters. We're always looking for things that are just as good that get the job done. We don't have the last word in the right tools, but you want a good survey from those angles. And then increasingly with older kids who are gaining skill, a test of morphological awareness is going to probably be helpful and add more information. And there is one that is in development now that may be accessible to all of you in a few months.
Well, we're excited about that. Question, if you had a try this tomorrow for our session, the teachers could try tomorrow to advance spelling, what would that be?
Well, I would say, well, first of all, I have to know more about your students. But the first thing is, do you have a good scope and sequence of spelling concepts? And here's another thing that's important. I don't know if I say much about it in the chapter, but at the kindergarten, first grade level, there's not much difference between what you teach in reading and spelling, and the spelling words can be part of the reading decoding lesson. By second grade, these skills diverge. First of all, kids should be progressing faster in reading than they are in spelling. So they need a spelling program and spelling instruction that is by design moves a little more slowly and that follows along with what's been taught in reading, but that takes into account some of the differences between learning the code for spelling and learning it for reading. And the best example of that is R-controlled vowels. R-controlled vowels in reading are not that hard. R-controlled vowels for spelling are terrible. So you have to take that into account, and you cannot just throw a bunch of R-controlled vowels at kids. Or they may be, in reading, kids may be able to read several, if they're progressing well, a couple of patterns for a long vowel. For spelling, to throw in several patterns for the long vowel O, for example, all at once, if there are kids who have spelling problems, that might be overwhelming, and you might have to teach each pattern gradually and think of titrating, adding things in as the basic most frequent patterns get anchored. There are some kids who need a few examples and then they've internalized it all and they're ready to go. Others who need an inordinate amount of practice. And then you also have to consider, okay, so I guess the first thing is do good diagnostic work on where your kids are, because that will tell you, and then you have to have a scope and sequence, and of course, good word lists, and hopefully actually some lessons that are written out so you don't have to invent it from scratch. But that's mainly it. Figure out where the kids are in relation to some, really good template for where the roadmap for where you need to go.
Thank you, Dr. Moats. So I think you answered this next question: how closely aligned should reading instruction be with spelling when it takes some spellers longer to develop automaticity and accuracy with spelling patterns? I pretty much think you answered that. If you want to add anything to that, I think that you did answer that one.
Well, take kids who have real spelling, reading difficulties, who are getting good reading therapy, if you will, if you want to use that word, using an Orton Gillingham aligned approach, or using Linda Mood Bell, or using something that's really well designed. And there are other things as well. Okay, then what's likely to happen is the students are likely to progress in reading significantly faster than in spelling. And one of the differences I have with some other colleagues out there is I do not think it is wise to expect the kids to master the spelling, the spellings of those patterns that they're learning in reading in order to progress in reading. And what actually happens with a lot of dyslexic kids is a divergence of what they can do in reading. You don't want to hold them back in reading. And I know there are going to be people on this call who vehemently disagree with me, but I think keep chipping away at the spelling, working on the spelling where the kids are, and accelerate their progress in reading if they're, say, a fifth grader or a sixth grader doing remediation. That's my preference. Thank
you. As you would expect, when you said you're working on a spelling program for fourth grade students, there's lots of questions that flooded in. I'm assuming that's spellography that you're
Spellography, yeah. Okay, I can do a little plug if you don't mind.
Not at all.
Yeah. Bruce and I are rewriting spellography, and we're formatting it. And one of the things I'll be looking for is volunteers to pilot it for us in the fall. I probably shouldn't have said that to 600 people, but if anybody wants to raise their hand, if anybody's working with fourth and fifth grade kids who are not great at spelling, you can contact me directly, because we will want to pilot it and get teacher feedback before we do a full-blown it's sending it into the world.
There are 419 people. And then all of a sudden,
okay, cool. I'll just get some names. Thank you.
You're going to be flooded with emails. Okay. And primary spelling by pattern?
I don't know what's going to happen with that. I've been told I can get the rights back to that, but nothing has happened yet. But regardless, if we get the books A and B of spellography out in the world, then if I still have the energy, I will want to bring it down, and maybe we'll have a primary spellography at that point. That might be the easiest way to do it.
Well, we hope that you do.
Thank you. Look at all the hands. Oh, I love this. Okay, you better send me an email. It's louisa.moats@gmail.com. And I would love, to have a conversation with those of you who are raising your hands.
Your email box is going to be flooded, Dr. Moats. Next question. Can Dr. Moats repeat what she said about why it is harder for children to spell those grammatical glue words?
Yeah, well, I think it has something to do with, well, first of all, some of them are quite irregular and don't really belong in any word family anywhere. So they're just unique words that they float around in our brains, like the word of. How do you remember that? you have to associate the print with speech. But if speech isn't giving you a clue about what the letters should be, then your brain has to do extra work, and it has to say, oh, the sounds are of, and it's really strange that we use the letters OF for those sounds. And you have to notice that, but you're still engaged in the process of mapping. There is still, the only way you retrieve that is through the pronunciation of the word, and then the letters have to get conjured up. I'm not sure. And one of the reasons why we don't understand this terribly well is that a lot of the instructional practices that have been subject to experimentation in the past have not really gotten to this, this problem of we're teaching language and we're teaching speech to print. And so how do we do that? And which clues are going to help kids remember? What usually happens is there's just some kind of rote process, like tracing the word until it sticks behind the eyeball. Well, tracing can be done in a very unconscious way. And I have to call it a theory. It's grounded in research, but it really is that when we understand and think about something, and in that way it makes sense to us, we're more likely to remember it. So that's what we're after. And we have to do more experimentation to see how we can make that principle of learning actually work here.
All right. Where would you backtrack to what you would recommend for students who read on grade level and are able to decode for the most part, but have great difficulty with encoding, including high frequency words?
Kind of backtrack right to the beginning. Do they have phoneme awareness? Can they take the speech sounds apart in the word that you want them to spell? Do they recognize the identity of those sounds? And I'm thinking very much of what Mary Dahlgren has done with her sound walls. I mean, to me, that is absolutely on target. It's absolutely, Mary Dahlgren has given us a gift of materials that get at that, the identity of the sounds. And then, and you work from there. Can the kids progress through a logical sequence of being able to spell? I think we do have to start with short vowel correspondences because the spellings are much more predictable. And then we move to the patterns. I think in letters, we have a kind of general scope and sequence to lay it out, but it's not as detailed as you need in order to work on this. And you're reminding me that I and others need to produce better instructional materials that start at the beginning and help you lead kids through this sequence. I'm thinking also, what else can I think of? The spell links, people know what they're doing. Janine Herron, who has her kindergarten talking fingers program, which is online. She knows what she's doing with this. So there are others who have done good programming.
Well, I think you can see from all the hands raising, whatever you produce.
That's very nice. Thank you. That's so affirming. It makes me want to continue and work on this. And
well, we are glad.
Partnership with so many knowledgeable people.
We're very excited as well that Dr. Moats will be joining us for the Patent Literacy Symposium. She's going to kick off a symposium with a keynote, and she'll also be doing a session. So we're very, very honored. Dr. Moats has been a long-time friend of Patent, and we're always so honored to have her with us. And I've been want to tell you, Dr. Moats, I don't think you can see the chat, but throughout your presentation, I can't tell you how many chats I've received about their thanks for you this evening. I'm seeing them again over and over and over again. So, and I've already seen things posted on Twitter about how awesome this session was. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn over now to Jeannie Hertzler, who's going to share information with you about our closing and some information about who will be joining us next week.
Thanks, Pam. So Dr. Moats, we were so excited to have you with us this evening. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight for Chapter 4, Structured Literacy Interventions for Spelling. Please know that the recording for this session will be available on our Patent Literacy Resource Hub. So Karen, I'm not sure if you can add that link again to our chat, please, so everyone has that. Because I know people will want to be listening again to this recording. So thank you very much.